Female German prison of wars were shocked when they saw tall and handsome men in U.S. base camp. April 19th, 1945, 14 miles west of Leipzig, Germany. The morning fog hung thick across the bombed-out industrial district as Oberhelfer Greta Muller pressed herself against the cold brick wall of a collapsed factory. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, once gray and crisp, was now brown with mud and smoke residue. At 23 years old, she had spent the last 8 months serving as a communications specialist with Army Group Center, believing every word of Goebbels' assurances that final victory was merely weeks away. Through the rubble-strewn street, she could hear the distinctive rumble of American Sherman tanks. Her unit, 12 women from the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the female signal corps, had been cut off during the chaotic retreat 3 days earlier. They had no radio, no food, and only 6 rifle rounds among them. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Surrender or die. The decision was made for them at 7:15 that morning when American infantry from the 69th Infantry Division appeared at both ends of the street. Greta watched as her commanding officer, Hauptmann Weber, a stern woman of 40 who had fought in Poland and France, slowly raised her hands above her head. The gesture felt like betrayal of everything they had sworn to defend. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for this moment with terrifying certainty. American soldiers, they had been told repeatedly, showed no mercy to German women. The stories spread through Wehrmacht barracks were explicit and horrifying. But what happened next contradicted 4 years of indoctrination in less than 4 minutes. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The American soldiers approaching them were impossibly tall. At least that was Greta's first impression. The average German soldier stood 5 feet 7 inches tall on scarce wartime rations. These Americans towered above 6 feet, their uniforms clean, their faces healthy and well-fed. The contrast was immediate and unsettling. They moved with casual confidence, weapons lowered but ready, calling out commands in accented German that would have been comical under different circumstances. A young sergeant, perhaps 25, approached Hauptmann Weber. He was at least 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders that filled his uniform jacket. His face was clean-shaven, his teeth remarkably white when he spoke. "Guten Tag," he said carefully, then switched to English. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The translator, a German-American private from Milwaukee, repeated the words with perfect grammar. Greta noticed the American sergeant's hands. They were clean. His fingernails weren't broken or blackened. He smelled of soap, something she hadn't encountered on a soldier in months. Within 32 minutes, the 12 German women were loaded onto a truck with canvas sides and wooden benches. They expected the worst. Instead, they received canteens of clean water and boxes of K rations, the American field meals that German soldiers had learned to prize above their own supplies whenever they captured them. Greta opened hers mechanically. Inside, she found crackers, processed cheese, a chocolate bar, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. She had not seen chocolate in 3 years. As the truck rolled west toward American lines, Greta pressed her face against the canvas opening and watched the endless columns of American vehicles moving east. Hundreds of trucks, all identical, all loaded with supplies. Tanks, jeeps, ambulances, mobile kitchens. Everything was standardized, mass-produced, overwhelming. The sheer abundance of equipment moving casually down a single road exceeded what Army Group Center had possessed at its peak strength. It was then that the first crack appeared in Greta's ideological certainty. If the Americans could afford to give captured enemies chocolate and cigarettes, if they possessed such material abundance that waste was meaningless, then everything the Reich had promised about winning through willpower and sacrifice had been a fantasy built on lies. The chocolate bar in her hand weighed 50 grams, but its psychological weight was immeasurable. April 20th, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, a temporary prisoner of war processing facility near Halle, Germany. The converted German barracks complex had been captured intact 2 weeks earlier and now served as a collection point for Wehrmacht prisoners awaiting transport to permanent camps. Greta Muller and her 11 companions stepped down from the truck at 4:30 in the afternoon, expecting confinement that matched everything Nazi propaganda had promised. Barbed wire, certainly. Guard towers, inevitably. But cruelty and deprivation, the cornerstones of every briefing about American prisoner treatment, were nowhere evident. The shock began at the gate. An American medical officer, a captain with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, approached with a clipboard and a gentle smile that seemed completely inappropriate for a captor. "Welcome to Camp Philadelphia," the translator relayed. "You'll be processed, examined medically, given clean clothes and quarters, and fed a hot meal. You are protected under the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. The medical examination took place in a heated building with electric lights that actually worked. This alone was remarkable. Electricity in Germany had become sporadic at best. Cities operated on rotating blackouts. Military installations made do with generators and candles. Yet here, in a temporary American facility, established mere days ago, electric lights blazed without concern for rationing or conservation. A female army nurse, Corporal Patricia Henderson from Iowa, examined each woman with professional efficiency and surprising gentleness. She noted injuries, recorded medical histories through the translator, and administered tetanus shots with needles that were sharp and sterile. Greta's medical record from the German military had documented her height at 5 feet 4 inches and her weight at 118 pounds before the war. Corporal Henderson weighed her at 94 pounds. The nurse's expression showed concern, not judgment. "You're malnourished," the translator conveyed. "We'll make sure you get proper food." After processing, the women were led to their quarters. Greta had prepared herself for a crowded cell, or perhaps a tent with minimal protection from the April cold. Instead, they were assigned to a wooden barracks building that had previously housed German officers. The space contained 12 cots with actual mattresses, not straw-filled sacks, wool blankets, clean and smelling faintly of American soap, a working stove in the center, windows with intact glass. On each cot lay a package. Inside, Greta found underwear, socks, a clean work dress, toiletries including real soap, and a toothbrush with actual bristles, and a towel. At the bottom was another chocolate bar and a small bag of hard candy. Anna Weiss, the quietest of their group, sat on her cot holding the soap and began to cry. She had not cried when their unit was bombed. She had not cried during the 3-day retreat through burning cities, but the simple gift of clean soap, given freely to an enemy, broke something inside her that propaganda could not rebuild. At 6 o'clock, they were called to the mess hall. The building was warm, heated by a furnace that ran continuously. The smell hit them first: cooking meat, real coffee, bread baking. Greta's stomach cramped with hunger that had become so constant she had learned to ignore it. The meal was served cafeteria style. American soldiers dished out portions with metal serving spoons. Greta received a metal tray that was clean and warm to the touch. On it was placed beef stew with visible chunks of meat and potatoes, white bread with butter, a portion of canned fruit, a cup of real coffee with sugar and condensed milk, and a slice of cake. The quantity exceeded what German civilians received in a week. This was prisoner food, enemy food, handed to them by soldiers who smiled and occasionally attempted broken German pleasantries. Hauptmann Weber, sitting beside Greta, stared at her tray for a full minute before picking up her fork. When she finally took the first bite, tears streamed down her weathered face. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Everything they had believed about American barbarism was crumbling with every spoonful. That night, lying on a real mattress under warm blankets in a heated room, Greta tried to reconcile the contradictions. The Americans were supposed to be weak, decadent, incapable of matching German military prowess. Yet they had destroyed the Wehrmacht with overwhelming industrial might. They were supposed to be cruel to prisoners, yet they fed enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Understanding the truth meant accepting that every sacrifice, every hardship, every promise of victory had been built on systematic lies. It meant acknowledging that the Reich had sent them to fight for a cause that was not only lost but morally bankrupt from its inception. Sleep came slowly. April 21st, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, morning formation. The spring sun broke through the morning clouds as Greta and her companions assembled in the camp yard for their first full day in American custody. They had been issued work assignments, though these were voluntary under Geneva Convention rules. Most of the women volunteered anyway. Idleness felt more oppressive than labor. Greta was assigned to the camp kitchen alongside Anna Weiss and 3 other women from their unit. The assignment itself was unremarkable. What struck them was the kitchen's abundance. Walk-in refrigerators hummed with electricity, their shelves stocked with more food than Greta had seen in one place since 1941. Crates of eggs, boxes of butter, slabs of bacon, whole chickens, vegetables that weren't withered or rotten. The Americans operated this temporary facility with supply chains that would have supported a German division for weeks. The head cook, Staff Sergeant Walter Harris from Georgia, was a large man with dark skin and an easy smile. Greta had never seen a black American before. Nazi propaganda had taught her that black Americans were treated as slaves, beaten and degraded by their white masters. Yet Sergeant Harris commanded the kitchen with authority that the white soldiers respected without question. He gave orders. They followed. The racial hierarchy existed only in German propaganda, not in American reality. Through the translator, Sergeant Harris explained their duties. Simple food preparation, peeling potatoes, washing vegetables, setting up meal service. He demonstrated each task with patience, never raising his voice. When Anna accidentally dropped a crate of eggs, breaking 2 dozen, she flinched and raised her arms defensively, expecting punishment. Sergeant Harris simply shrugged and said something that made the translator laugh. He says it happens to everyone. He broke a whole case yesterday. Says eggs are cheap and people are valuable. This simple statement contained a revolutionary concept. In the German military, waste was punished severely. A soldier who damaged equipment through carelessness could face court-martial. Here, the American sergeant valued his workers above the materials they handled. The priorities were inverted from everything Greta understood about military discipline. At 10 o'clock, Sergeant Harris called for a break. He poured coffee for everyone, including the German prisoners. Real coffee, not. The ersatz coffee Germans had drunk for 4 years, made from roasted acorns and chicory. He added sugar and cream without measuring, then offered around a tin of cookies. Oatmeal cookies with raisins, each one the size of Greta's palm. His mama sends these every month, the translator explained. He says his family owns a bakery in Savannah. He wants to know if you ladies like to bake. Anna nodded hesitantly. Before the war, she had worked in her family's bakery in Stuttgart. Sergeant Harris's face lit up. For the next 20 minutes, he and Anna communicated through broken German, hand gestures, and sketches on paper, discussing different types of bread and pastry. The translator could barely keep up. Greta watched in amazement as her companion, who had spent months learning to hate Americans as subhuman mongrels, animatedly discussed the merits of sourdough starter with an American sergeant whose grandmother had taught him to bake. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. After lunch service, a young American soldier approached Greta. He was tall, at least 6 feet 1 inch, with broad shoulders and light brown hair that fell across his forehead. His uniform identified him as Sergeant Thomas Carter of the 69th Infantry Division. He carried a wooden crate filled with books. "Sprechen Sie English?" he asked carefully. Greta shook her head. She had studied English in school before the war, but had practiced little since. Sergeant Carter gestured to the books. Through the translator, he explained that the camp had received a donation of books in German from the Red Cross. He wanted to know if the women's barracks would like some for their free time. Poetry, novels, technical manuals. He began pulling volumes from the crate. Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, books that had been banned in Germany since 1933. Greta selected a worn copy of All Quiet on the Western Front, the anti-war novel that had been burned by the Nazis. Sergeant Carter nodded approvingly and handed her 3 more books. "He says reading helps pass the time," the translator conveyed. "And he says if you want to practice English, he can bring English books too." He was a teacher before the war. A teacher. This tall, strong American soldier had been a school teacher. He had left his classroom to fight the Reich, and now he was offering books to his enemies. The gesture seemed impossibly kind, almost naive. Yet it was happening. That evening, Greta sat on her cot reading Remarque's forbidden novel by electric light in a heated room. Around her, the other women read or wrote letters home that the Americans would allow them to send through the Red Cross. Outside, American soldiers walked past their windows on patrol, and nobody feared them. The walls were crumbling. April 23rd, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, morning work detail. A spring rain had softened the ground overnight, and the camp perimeter fence had collapsed, under the weight of mud and poor foundation work. The American camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison, called for a work party to repair the damage. Among the volunteers were 8 German women prisoners, including Greta and Anna. They were curious to see if the Americans would trust them with tools and relative freedom outside the wire. Sergeant Thomas Carter led the work detail. He arrived at the German women's barracks at 7 in the morning carrying wooden toolboxes and wearing work gloves. Through the translator, he explained the task. They needed to dig new post holes, set fresh posts, and restring the fence wire. Simple construction work that would take most of the day. The women would work alongside American soldiers, not under guard, but as collaborators in a shared task. The tools themselves told a story. Each woman received a proper shovel with a solid handle, work gloves that fit reasonably well, and a canteen of water. The Americans provided these without hesitation, handing potential weapons to enemy prisoners. The trust was either naive or profound, and Greta could not determine which. The work began awkwardly. The American soldiers were stronger, capable of digging deeper holes with less effort, but they were also clumsy with the finer work. When it came time to measure proper spacing for the posts, Anna took charge, her precision and attention to detail outpacing the Americans. Sergeant Carter recognized this immediately and deferred to her judgment, asking her to supervise the layout while he and his men provided the muscle for digging. By mid-morning, the awkwardness had transformed into something resembling teamwork. An American private named Danny Morrison from Kansas, barely 19 years old, worked beside Greta to steady a post while she packed soil around its base. He hummed while he worked, popular American songs she did not recognize. When she struggled to lift a heavy bucket of gravel, he took it from her without making her feel weak, simply lifting it as though it weighed nothing and pouring it where she indicated. At noon, Sergeant Harris arrived with lunch. Not mess hall food, but sandwiches he had prepared specially. Thick slices of ham and cheese on white bread, wrapped in waxed paper. Fresh apples. More cookies. He distributed them equally among Americans and Germans, making no distinction between captor and captive. They sat together in the mud, eating and resting, and for a moment the war seemed very far away. Sergeant Carter pulled out a photograph from his wallet. His family, he explained through the translator. Mother, father, 2 younger sisters. They lived on a farm in Pennsylvania. He had been a high school history teacher before Pearl Harbor. He missed his students. He talked about them with genuine affection, describing their personalities and dreams. Then he asked Greta about her life before the war. The question was dangerous. To answer honestly meant revealing humanity she had been, trained to suppress. But sitting in the mud, holding a sandwich made with more meat than she had eaten in a month, Greta found herself answering. She had worked in an office in Dresden, she told him, secretary for a shipping company. She had loved music, wanted to study at the conservatory. Then the war came, then the bombs came, then everything came apart. Sergeant Carter listened without judgment. He did not mention that American bombers had destroyed Dresden. He did not need to. The knowledge hung between them, acknowledged but not weaponized. When Greta finished speaking, he simply nodded and said something that the translator conveyed quietly. He says he's sorry for what you've lost, and he hopes you can find music again when this is over. The simplicity of the sentiment struck Greta harder than any propaganda speech. This was not American weakness or naive sentimentality. This was strength so complete that it could afford mercy. A nation secure enough in victory that it could treat defeated enemies with dignity. By late afternoon, the fence was complete. The posts stood straight, the wire strung tight. American soldiers and German prisoners had built something together, and it stood solid. As they gathered tools and prepared to return to the barracks, Corporal James Martinez from California approached with a harmonica. He played a simple folk melody, something gentle and melancholy. Anna closed her eyes and swayed slightly. Greta realized she was humming along. That evening, Sergeant Carter brought more books to the women's barracks. This time, he included English primers and a German-English dictionary. He explained through the translator that if any of the women wanted to learn English, he would teach them in the evenings. Not as a requirement, simply as an offer. Greta accepted. April 25th, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, evening education session. 3 women from Greta's unit sat in a small classroom that had once served as a German Wehrmacht officer's briefing room. Now it held desks, chairs, a chalkboard, and Sergeant Thomas Carter with an English grammar textbook. The Americans had converted a space designed for teaching war into a place for teaching language. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Sergeant Carter wrote simple English phrases on the board. Hello. Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Basic courtesy phrases that formed the foundation of communication. Greta and Anna practiced pronunciation while Helga Schmidt, a 30-year-old signals operator from Munich, watched with visible skepticism. Helga had been the most fervent Nazi believer among their group, and she struggled visibly with every act of American kindness. Outside the classroom, the contradictions multiplied daily. The Americans fed them 3 meals every day, more food than German civilians received. The barracks remained heated, even as German cities froze. Medical care was provided without hesitation. A dentist from Philadelphia had examined all the women prisoners, treating cavities and infections that had gone untreated for months. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was abused. Nobody even raised their voice. Yet at night, when the lights went out, the whispered conversations revealed the internal warfare still being fought in German hearts. They are weak, Helga insisted in the darkness of their barracks. They treat us well because they are soft, sentimental. They lack the will to dominate. This is why we nearly defeated them. Anna's voice came from across the room, quiet but firm. We did not nearly defeat them. They buried us under steel and bombs. They fed us with chocolate while their factories produced more weapons than we could count. That is not weakness. The argument played out most nights. Some women, like Helga, clung to the propaganda framework, because accepting the truth meant confronting the waste of everything they had believed. Others, like Anna, had already made the psychological leap. They understood that German propaganda had been a systematic lie, and that accepting this lie earlier might have prevented catastrophic destruction. Greta existed somewhere between these positions, balanced uncomfortably on the edge of transformation. During the day, working beside Americans who treated her with respect, she felt the old certainties crumbling. But at night, alone with her thoughts, doubt crept back. What if the kindness was temporary? What if this was an elaborate deception? What if they were being prepared for something worse? On April 27th, these doubts crystallized into crisis. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison announced during morning formation that the women prisoners would be transferred to a permanent facility in France within 2 weeks. The news spread through the German prisoners like electric current. Transfer meant uncertainty. Change meant risk. The familiar safety of Camp Philadelphia, as strange as that concept seemed, would be replaced by unknown variables. That evening, Greta confronted Sergeant Carter during their English lesson. She asked him directly, through careful, halting English she had practiced all day, what would happen to them in France. Sergeant Carter set down his chalk and sat on the edge of his desk. He spoke slowly so she could understand, occasionally switching to German words when necessary. You will go to a larger camp, more prisoners there. British and French also guard it. You will work, like here, maybe in fields, maybe in factories. The war is ending, maybe a few weeks more. When Germany surrenders, you can go home. Home? Greta repeated. The word felt foreign. Dresden was rubble. Her family had evacuated to relatives in the countryside. Home was a concept without physical form. Sergeant Carter seemed to understand. Then you make a new home, rebuild. That is what people do after wars end. They rebuild. After the lesson, Greta walked back to the barracks alone. The spring evening was warm, the first genuinely pleasant weather since her capture. American soldiers nodded to her as she passed. No one challenged her. No one threatened her. She could have walked to the fence and perhaps found a gap in the wire. But where would she go? Germany was a corpse. The Reich that had promised glory had delivered only ash. In the barracks, Helga was arguing again. She had heard news from another prisoner that Hitler was preparing a counteroffensive. Secret weapons would turn the tide. Victory was still possible. The Führer would never surrender. Anna finally lost her patience. Hitler is in a bunker in Berlin waiting to die. The Führer is a madman who destroyed our country for his ego. We lost because we were lied to. We lost because the Americans had chocolate for their prisoners while our soldiers starved. Wake up, Helga. The war is over. We lost. And maybe that is better than winning would have been. The barracks went silent. Speaking such words would have meant execution a month. Now, they simply hung in the air, true and undeniable. Greta lay on her cot that night holding the English primer Sergeant Carter had given her. On the first page, he had written an inscription in careful German script. Language is a bridge. May you cross safely to the other side. She had not yet decided whether to cross that bridge, but she was no longer certain she wanted to remain where she was. April 29th, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, maintenance shed. The morning had started routinely. Greta and Anna worked in the camp kitchen, preparing lunch for 200 prisoners and guards. The menu was beef stew again, along with bread and canned fruit. More food than seemed possible, yet the Americans served it without hesitation. By 10:30, the women had finished their assigned tasks and were returning to the barracks when they heard the crash. Private Danny Morrison, the young soldier from Kansas who had worked beside them on the fence repair, had been on the roof of the maintenance shed replacing damaged shingles when the ladder collapsed. He fell 12 feet onto the concrete below. The sound of his body hitting the ground carried across the camp yard like a gunshot. American soldiers rushed to the scene immediately. Greta and Anna ran with them, driven by instinct rather than thought. By the time they arrived, Morrison lay on his back, conscious but clearly in pain. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped through his trouser leg where bone had broken through skin. His face had gone white. He was trying not to scream. The camp medic, Corporal James Fletcher, arrived within minutes carrying his medical bag. He assessed the injury quickly. Compound fracture of the tibia, possible concussion, shock setting in rapidly. He called for assistance. The camp's main medical officer was treating a truck accident victim 2 miles away. The ambulance had gone with him. Help would take at least 30 minutes. Corporal Fletcher looked around at the gathered soldiers and prisoners. His eyes settled on Greta. Through the translator who had followed the commotion, he asked a question that would change everything. Can you help me? I need steady hands to hold supplies while I stabilize the leg. Every instinct told Greta to refuse. She was a prisoner. This was an American soldier. The propaganda still whispered in her mind that this might be a trap, a test, a trick. But Morrison's face had gone even whiter. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He was 19 years old and terrified. Greta knelt beside Corporal Fletcher. The medic worked with calm efficiency, explaining each step as he went. He needed Greta to hold Morrison's legs steady while he cut away the trouser fabric. She held it, feeling the boy's muscles trembling beneath her hands. Fletcher needed her to hand him supplies from his bag. Scissors, gauze, sulfa powder, morphine syringe. She provided each one. Morrison looked at her through pain-glazed eyes. He tried to smile. "German angel," he whispered in broken German he had learned from other prisoners. "Danke." The phrase broke something inside Greta that propaganda had built. This boy had shared his lunch with her while they repaired the fence. He had shown her photographs of his family's farm in Kansas. He had treated her with respect when he had every reason to hate her. And now he called her an angel while she helped save his life. Fletcher applied a temporary splint, administering morphine to ease Morrison's pain. Within 20 minutes, the ambulance returned and medics loaded Morrison onto a stretcher. Before they took him away, he reached for Greta's hand and squeezed it once. The gesture needed no translation. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called Greta to his office. She entered expecting punishment or interrogation. Instead, the commander thanked her. Corporal Fletcher had reported her assistance. Harrison explained that Morrison would recover fully, because she had helped stabilize him quickly. "You didn't have to help," Harrison said through the translator. "You're a prisoner. You could have walked away. But you chose compassion. That says more about your character than any uniform ever could." That evening, Sergeant Thomas Carter brought news to the women's barracks. Morrison was in surgery at the base hospital. The doctors expected him to keep his leg. He would walk again. The news spread through the German prisoners like electricity. They had helped save an American soldier. Their enemy had become a person they cared about. Helga approached Greta after dinner, her face troubled. For weeks she had clung to her Nazi beliefs, insisting American kindness was weakness. Now she spoke quietly, almost broken. "You saved him. He would have thanked a Jew the same way he thanked you. They really believe we are all human." Greta nodded. "Yes, they do." That night, Greta wrote her first letter home to her mother in German-occupied territory that the Red Cross would deliver. She described Morrison's accident. She described helping save his life. She described the impossible truth that her enemies had shown her more humanity than her own government ever had. She ended the letter with words that would have been treasonous a month earlier. "Mother, we lost more than the war. We lost our souls. The Americans are teaching me how to find mine again." May 2nd, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, morning formation. The spring morning was unusually cold, and Greta pulled her issued American wool jacket tighter as Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood before the assembled prisoners. Beside him stood a colonel she had never seen before, wearing the insignia of the Allied Expeditionary Force headquarters. The stranger's presence felt ominous. Harrison spoke through the translator with his usual directness. Within 10 days, all female prisoners at Camp Philadelphia would be transferred to a permanent facility in France. The decision came from higher headquarters. The women would join other prisoners of war at a larger camp near Reims, where they would await final disposition after Germany's surrender. Transportation would be arranged. They should prepare for departure. The announcement landed like a physical blow. Greta felt Anna grab her arm for support. Around them, the other women reacted with visible shock. Transfer meant leaving this place of unexpected safety. Transfer meant uncertainty. Transfer meant losing the fragile connections they had built with American soldiers who had treated them with unprecedented kindness. Helga's reaction was different. She smiled, a tight, bitter expression. That evening in the barracks, she gave voice to what some women were thinking, but had not dared speak. "You see? It was temporary. They fattened us up and treated us well because it cost them nothing. Now they ship us away like cargo. This kindness was always an illusion." Anna challenged her immediately. "They transfer us because the war is ending. They need to consolidate prisoners for processing and repatriation. It is logistics, not cruelty." But doubt had entered the barracks like cold wind through a cracked window. For weeks, the women had experienced treatment that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They had begun to trust. They had begun to transform. Now that transformation felt premature and possibly foolish. What if Helga was right? What if American kindness extended only as far as convenience allowed? Greta struggled with questions that had no easy answers. She had helped save Morrison's life, and in doing so had acknowledged that American soldiers were human beings worthy of her compassion. She had learned English from Sergeant Carter, and through language had found connection that transcended nationality. She had worked beside Americans, eaten with them, laughed with them. She had begun to imagine a future where former enemies could build something better than what had been destroyed. Now that future felt uncertain again. The next morning, Sergeant Carter arrived for their English lesson and found only Greta waiting. The other women had stopped attending. Carter understood without explanation. He sat at his desk quietly for a moment before speaking in careful German. "You think we are sending you away because we no longer care. This is not true. The war is ending. Germany will surrender within days. All prisoners must be processed for return home. This is not rejection. This is the beginning of peace." Greta struggled with her English response. "Peace for you. Destruction for us. Home is rubble. Family is scattered. Germany is dead." Carter leaned forward, his expression serious. "Germany, the nation, still exists. The Nazi regime is what is dead. That is different. You can rebuild. The Marshall Plan, what we are planning, will help you rebuild. We will not abandon Germany to starvation and chaos. We learned from the last war. This time will be different." His words were sincere, but sincerity did not guarantee truth. Greta wanted to believe him, but belief required trust that felt increasingly fragile. That evening, Corporal Fletcher brought news that transformed the camp's atmosphere. Morrison had been released from the hospital. He arrived on crutches, his leg in a full cast, grinning like he had won a lottery. He came directly to the women's barracks, against regulations, to thank Greta personally. "You saved my leg," he said through the translator. "Doctors said if the bone had shifted during transport, I would have lost it. You held it steady. You saved me." He pulled a photograph from his pocket. His family standing in front of their farmhouse in Kansas. Mother, father, 3 younger siblings. He pressed it into Greta's hand. "When you go home to Germany, keep this. Remember that an American family is grateful to you. Remember that we are not enemies forever. Wars end. People continue." The gesture shattered Greta's growing cynicism. Morrison had no reason to seek her out. He gained nothing from thanking an enemy prisoner. Yet he came anyway because gratitude transcended nationality. His kindness was not strategic or temporary. It was genuine. After Morrison left, Greta sat on her cot holding the photograph and weeping. Anna sat beside her, silent companionship worth more than words. Around them, the other women wrestled with their own confusion and guilt. They had been raised to hate. They had been taught that strength meant domination and compassion meant weakness. Now they confronted the reality that their strongest enemies had shown them the most compassion. The transformation was painful because it required acknowledging that everything they had sacrificed for had been built on lies. May 7th, 1945. Camp Philadelphia, evening. The radio in Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's office broadcast news that traveled through the camp within minutes. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers celebrated with restrained joy, conscious that the fighting continued in the Pacific. German prisoners received the news in silence. The Reich they had served no longer existed. Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in absolute destruction. Greta stood in the camp yard watching American soldiers embrace and shake hands. Their relief was visible and understandable. They would go home. Their sacrifice had purpose. Their cause had been just. For German prisoners, the emotion was more complex. Relief that the killing had stopped mixed with grief for everything lost and shame for everything wasted. Sergeant Carter found Greta standing alone near the fence as sunset painted the spring sky orange and pink. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering her one without speaking. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes before he spoke in English, knowing she could understand. "Tomorrow, I receive orders. I will probably go home within 2 months. Back to Pennsylvania, back to teaching. What will you do?" The question was more profound than it seemed. The transfer to France would happen in 3 days. From there, eventually, repatriation to Germany. But Germany was 4 zones of occupation, destroyed cities, displaced millions, an uncertain future. Going home meant returning to rubble, both physical and psychological. Carter seemed to sense her internal struggle. There is another option. Not many people know this yet, but the War Department is creating programs. Some prisoners, after screening, can apply to stay in America, work visas for farm labor and factory jobs. The country needs workers. You could apply. The possibility had never occurred to Greta. Stay in America? The nation that had been her enemy? The idea felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. She had spent 4 weeks in American captivity discovering that everything she had believed was false. The Americans were not weak or decadent. They were strong enough to show mercy. They were wealthy enough to feed enemies. They were confident enough to treat defeated opponents with dignity. More importantly, they represented something Germany had never offered her. Freedom to choose, freedom to question, freedom to become something other than what propaganda demanded. I could stay? She asked in halting English. German prisoner could become American worker? Carter nodded, after screening to ensure you were not involved in war crimes. But you were a communications specialist, a secretary before the war. You are exactly the kind of person who could qualify. You would have to work for a minimum of 2 years, learn English properly, follow American laws. But yes, you could stay. That night, Greta gathered with Anna and the other women for their final evening together before transfer. She presented Carter's information about the work visa program. The reactions varied predictably. Helga rejected the idea immediately. She would return to Germany, find her family if they still lived, and rebuild in the ruins. That was her duty. Others were uncertain, torn between loyalty to destroyed homeland and the opportunity for fresh start. Anna surprised everyone by speaking first. I will apply. My family is dead. Munich is rubble. In Germany, I am a defeated enemy. In America, I could be simply a person. That is enough. Her words crystallized something for Greta. In Germany, she would always be defined by the war. A woman who had served the Reich. A German who had lost. Someone to be pitied or judged, or both. In America, she could be undefined. A person who made a choice based on hope rather than history. The next morning, Greta requested a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. She stood in his office, nervous but determined, and asked through the translator if she could apply for the work visa program. Harrison studied her for a long moment before nodding. Corporal, Fletcher speaks highly of you. Sergeant Carter recommends you. You helped save an American soldier's life when you had no obligation to do so. I will forward your application with my strongest endorsement. The screening process takes approximately 2 months. You will go to France as scheduled, but if approved, you will return to the United States for job placement. 2 months of uncertainty. 2 months of waiting in a French camp wondering if she had made the right choice. But for the first time since her capture, Greta felt something that resembled hope. That evening, she wrote another letter to her mother. She explained her decision to apply for American residency. She knew her mother might view this as betrayal. But Greta no longer believed in the ideology that had defined betrayal so narrowly. Choosing life over death was not betrayal. Choosing hope over despair was not weakness. Choosing to build rather than mourn was not disloyalty. She ended the letter with an invitation. If the application was approved, if she successfully established herself in America, she would work to bring her mother over as well. The Americans were planning to help rebuild Germany, but they were also accepting immigrants who wanted to build new lives in America. The opportunity existed for both. Sergeant Carter brought her final English lesson that evening. He gave her a gift. A German-English dictionary, worn but serviceable, with an inscription on the first page written in careful English script. To Greta, who chose to cross the bridge. May you find home on the other side. Your friend, Thomas Carter. The word friend carried weight that transcended language. She had been his prisoner. Now she was his friend. That transformation represented everything America had taught her about the possibility of redemption. July 15th, 1945. Camp Lucky Strike, France. The letter arrived in the late afternoon mail delivery, carried by an American postal clerk who knew Greta by name after 2 months of daily mail checks. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope bearing the War Department seal. Anna stood beside her, silent support as always. Around them, other German prisoners prepared for repatriation to their occupied homeland. But Greta had been waiting for different news. The letter was brief and official. Her work visa application had been approved. She was cleared to immigrate to the United States under the Agricultural Worker Program. Transportation would be provided to New York within 3 weeks. From there, she would be placed with a farm family in Pennsylvania who had specifically requested German workers with her qualifications. The farm was in Lancaster County, approximately 40 miles from Philadelphia. Pennsylvania, Sergeant Thomas Carter's home state. Anna began to cry, but they were tears of joy mixed with sadness. Her own application had been approved the previous week. She would be placed with a family in Iowa who needed help with their dairy operation. The two friends would be separated by 1,000 miles, but they would both be in America. They would both have the chance to rebuild lives that war had destroyed. The 3 weeks passed quickly. Final medical examinations confirmed Greta was healthy. Final interviews verified she had never been a party member, never committed crimes, never held rank sufficient to warrant war crimes investigation. She had been a secretary who was conscripted as a signal corps operator. She had followed orders, but had not given them. She was, in the language of the screening officers, salvageable. On August 5th, 1945, Greta and 73 other approved German workers boarded a Liberty ship at Le Havre, bound for New York. The ship that carried them was called the Morrison. named for a sailor killed at Pearl Harbor. Greta did not know if it was the same Morrison she had helped save, but she chose to believe it was. The symbolism felt appropriate. She was crossing the ocean on a ship named for an American who had died fighting Germany, going to build a new life in the nation that had defeated her homeland but had shown her mercy. The crossing took 9 days. The accommodations were basic but adequate. The food was standard American military rations, which meant more than Greta had eaten regularly since before the war. She practiced her English with the ship's crew, young sailors who treated the German workers with curious politeness. They were former enemies, learning to be potential neighbors. New York Harbor appeared through morning fog on August 14th. Greta stood on the deck beside Anna, both women staring at the Statue of Liberty as it emerged from the mist. The symbolism was almost too obvious to bear. Liberty enlightening the world. The tired, the poor, the huddled masses. They were those masses now, defeated enemies seeking refuge in their conqueror's land. The immigration process at Ellis Island took 2 days. More paperwork. More questions. More examinations. Finally, approval stamps on temporary identity documents that would serve until proper work permits were issued. Greta Muller, immigrant worker, authorized to reside in the United States for a minimum period of 2 years with possibility of extension pending good behavior and employer satisfaction. On August 16th, she boarded a train to Pennsylvania. The countryside that passed her window was impossibly green and undamaged. No bomb craters, no burned villages, no refugees on the roads. America had fought the war from a distance, and its homeland showed no scars. The contrast with Germany was absolute. The train stopped at Lancaster Station at 4 in the afternoon. A family waited on the platform. John and Martha Brenner, their teenage son David, and their 10-year-old daughter Sarah. They held a sign that read, "Welcome, Greta," in English and German. When Greta stepped onto the platform with her single suitcase containing everything she owned, Martha Brenner did something completely unexpected. She embraced Greta like a daughter coming home. "Welcome to America," Martha said in careful German, learned specifically for this moment. "Welcome to your new home." The Brenner farm was 300 acres of rolling hills, cornfields, dairy cows, and a white farmhouse that looked like it belonged on a postcard. Greta's room was in the attic, small but clean with a real bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the fields. It was more space than she had lived in since before the war. That evening, over a dinner of roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and fresh bread, John Brenner explained her duties: help with cooking and household work, assist with bookkeeping for the farm accounts. Her secretarial skills would be valuable for managing paperwork. In exchange, room, board, $40 monthly salary, and English lessons from Martha, who had been a schoolteacher before marriage. After dinner, Greta walked outside into the summer evening. Fireflies danced over the fields. Cows grazed peacefully in the pasture. Somewhere a dog barked and children laughed. The war seemed very far away, almost unreal. She sat on the porch steps and realized she was home. Not Germany home, not the place she had come from, but home nonetheless, a place where she could build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. She pulled Morrison's photograph from her pocket, the Kansas farm family she had saved. She added it to the growing collection she carried. Sergeant Carter's address in Pennsylvania, written on the back of an English grammar lesson, Anna's temporary address in Iowa, her mother's last known location in Bavaria. These scraps of paper represented her new family, bound not by blood or nation, but by shared humanity discovered in impossible circumstances. Greta Muller had been a German soldier. Now she was simply Greta, beginning again. September 12th, 1985. Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Greta Brenner stood before 50 German exchange students visiting America for a semester of historical study. At 63 years old, she wore her gray hair in a simple bun and dressed in a blue cotton dress that her daughter Sarah had given her for Mother's Day. She had been asked to speak about her experiences as a German prisoner of war, part of a program designed to help young Germans understand the transformation their nation had undergone in 40 years. The students sat quietly, some taking notes, others simply listening. They were the generation born decades after the war, raised in democratic West Germany, allied with the United States. They knew the history intellectually, but understanding it emotionally required stories like Greta's. She began as she always did, with the moment of capture. April 19th, 1945, 14 miles west of Leipzig. She described the fear and propaganda-driven expectations of American brutality. She described instead encountering tall soldiers who offered chocolate and water to their defeated enemies. The students listened with expressions that shifted from curiosity to discomfort to recognition. "I was taught that Americans were weak and cruel," Greta said in German, letting the program coordinator translate to English for the American officials present. I discovered they were strong enough to show mercy. That strength frightened me more than their weapons. I did not know how to understand an enemy who treated me with dignity. She told them about Camp Philadelphia, about Sergeant Walter Harris, who valued people above broken eggs, about the books Sergeant Thomas Carter brought to prisoners, about working beside American soldiers to repair a fence and discovering shared humanity and shared labor, about helping save Private Danny Morrison's life, and realizing in that moment that her enemy had become simply another human being in need of help. The transformation was not sudden, she explained. It was gradual, uncomfortable, painful. Every kind gesture forced me to confront lies I had believed. Every act of American generosity revealed the bankruptcy of Nazi ideology. I resisted because accepting the truth meant acknowledging that everything I had sacrificed for was worthless. She described the crisis when transfer was announced, the doubt that returned, the fear that American kindness had been temporary illusion, and then the choice she made to apply for American residency rather than return to destroyed Germany. I chose America not because I was disloyal to Germany, Greta said quietly. I chose America because I was finally loyal to myself. I chose hope over despair. I chose future over past. That choice saved my life. She told them about the 40 years since, marrying John and Martha Brenner's nephew Thomas in 1949. Yes, also named Thomas, she acknowledged with a smile. Working on the farm until they bought their own place in 1956. Raising 3 children who were thoroughly American but proud of their German heritage. Becoming an American citizen in 1953 while maintaining love for German culture and traditions. Building a life that honored both where she came from and where she chose to be. I remained in contact with Sergeant Thomas Carter, she continued. He became a history teacher as he planned. We exchanged Christmas cards for 35 years until his death last year. He never forgot the German prisoners he taught English. I never forgot the American soldier who treated enemies with dignity. We became friends across the divide of former hatred. That friendship represented everything good that came from that terrible war. She pulled a photograph from her purse. The original picture from Private Morrison, now preserved in a protective sleeve. The Kansas Farm Family, 1945. Beside it was a newer photograph from 1982. Morrison's family at a reunion. The young private was now a grandfather, still living on that same Kansas farm. This boy I helped save became a friend who visited us 3 times over the years. His family and mine remained connected. Former enemies became extended family. This is possible when people choose humanity over hatred. Greta finished her talk with words she had prepared carefully. Germany lost the war, but won the peace. Your generation lives in prosperity and freedom because America chose to rebuild rather than destroy, to invest rather than punish, to forgive rather than seek revenge. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Germany began in American hearts like those of Sergeant Carter and Private Morrison who saw enemies as future friends. Remember this as you study here. Remember that the strongest nations are those confident enough to show mercy. Remember that wars end but humanity continues. The students applauded. Afterward, several approached with questions. A young woman from Hamburg asked what Greta would say to Germans who still struggled with shame about the Nazi period. Greta's answer was immediate. Acknowledge the past honestly. Learn from it completely. Build the future differently. Shame without transformation is useless. Germany has transformed. That is what matters. That evening, Greta sat on her own porch in Lancaster County, watching the sun set over fields her family had worked for 30 years. Her husband Thomas sat beside her, reading the newspaper and occasionally commenting on politics. Their daughter called from California, where she worked as an engineer. Their sons checked in from their own farms nearby. This was the life she had built from the ruins of war. She thought about that young German girl standing in the fog near Leipzig, terrified and indoctrinated, and convinced her enemies were monsters. She thought about the tall American sergeant who had offered books and kindness when he could have offered cruelty. She thought about the transformation that seemed impossible, but had happened anyway, slowly and painfully and completely. Greta Brenner had been shocked when she first saw those tall, handsome American soldiers at Camp Philadelphia. Shocked by their kindness, shocked by their humanity, shocked by their willingness to treat enemies with dignity. That shock had saved her life and shaped everything that followed. The greatest victory of the war, she had come to believe, was not military conquest but moral transformation. America had defeated Germany on the battlefield. But America had saved Germans like Greta through simple acts of compassion that proved more powerful than any weapon. That was the story worth telling. That was the legacy worth preserving. That was the truth her grandchildren needed to understand. As darkness fell over Pennsylvania, Greta closed her eyes and felt grateful for the impossible journey that had brought her here. From enemy to prisoner to immigrant to citizen to grandmother. From hatred to uncertainty to hope to peace. The war had ended 40 years ago. But its lessons continued. Choose mercy over vengeance. Choose humanity over ideology. Choose hope over despair. Those choices, made daily by imperfect people striving to be better, were what built the peace that followed the war. Greta Brenner had lived that truth. Now she taught it to the next generation, knowing that memory was the bridge between past and future, and that the tall, handsome American soldiers who had shocked her with their kindness had given her more than freedom. They had given her a second chance at life itself. November 3rd, 1953. Lancaster County Courthouse, Pennsylvania. Greta Muller stood in a courtroom filled with 47 other immigrants awaiting the final step in a journey that had begun 8 years earlier in the ruins of Germany. She wore her best dress, navy blue with white collar, purchased with money saved from farm wages. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a small American flag, one of 48, distributed to the citizenship candidates that morning. The federal judge, Honorable Marcus Richardson, was a veteran of World War I who had fought against Germany at Belleau Wood. He was 72 years old with white hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen too much death. When he looked at the German immigrants standing before him, Greta wondered what he saw. Former enemies? Potential Americans? Both? Judge Richardson began his address in a voice that carried authority earned through decades on the bench. He spoke about the meaning of citizenship, the responsibilities it carried, the freedoms it guaranteed. The oath they would take in moments would transform them legally, but true citizenship, he emphasized, required more than legal documents. You came to America from nations we fought against, Richardson said, his gaze moving across the German and Italian immigrants who composed most of the group. Some of you wore uniforms that fired on American soldiers. Some of you believed ideologies that threatened everything this nation represents. But you chose to come here. You chose to work honestly. You chose to learn our language and our laws. That choice matters more than your past. Greta felt tears building but refused to let them fall. 8 years had taught her that Americans valued emotional restraint as much as emotional honesty. She had learned to balance both. The oath was administered in English. Greta's pronunciation was still imperfect after years of study, but she spoke every word clearly. I hereby declare, on oath, that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. The words felt heavy and necessary. She was renouncing Germany legally while honoring it culturally. The distinction mattered. After the ceremony, John and Martha Brenner hosted a celebration at the farm. Neighbors arrived with covered dishes and congratulations. These were people who had sons and brothers who died fighting Germany, yet they welcomed Greta as one of their own. The cognitive dissonance that had defined her first months in America had transformed into something resembling belonging. Thomas Brenner's nephew, also named Thomas, had returned from army service in Korea 6 months earlier. He was 28, tall like so many Americans, with steady hands that knew farm work and gentle eyes that had seen combat. He had been coming to Sunday dinners for months, ostensibly to help his uncle with heavy work, but everyone noticed how he found reasons to talk with Greta, how she smiled differently when he arrived. That evening, after guests departed and dishes were washed, Thomas asked Greta to walk with him to the creek that bordered the property. The November air was cold, but the sky was clear and full of stars. They walked in comfortable silence until Thomas stopped at a wooden bridge crossing the water. I built this bridge with my uncle. When I was 12, he said. It connects 2 parts of the farm that used to be separate, makes everything more efficient. He paused, choosing words carefully. I think people need bridges, too, between past and future, between who they were and who they choose to become. Greta understood he was speaking about more than farm infrastructure. You know what I was? She said quietly. German soldier, enemy prisoner, immigrant worker. These things are true. I know who you are, Thomas corrected. Hard worker, honest person, good friend to my aunt and uncle, American citizen as of today. These things are also true. More true. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. I'm not good with fancy words, but I know what matters. You matter. Will you marry me? The question should have been impossible. American soldier proposing to former German enemy. But 8 years in America had taught Greta that impossible things happened regularly here. The impossible was simply the person. Possible that required courage to embrace. She said yes. They married on December 23rd, 1953, in the small Lutheran church where Greta had learned English from Martha Brenner and American hymns from the congregation. Sergeant Thomas Carter traveled from Philadelphia to attend, a witness to the transformation he had helped begin. Anna came from Iowa with her husband and 2 children. The church was full of Americans and German immigrants, former enemies united in celebration of love that transcended history. As Greta stood beside Thomas Brenner speaking vows that would bind their lives together, she thought about the terrified girl captured near Leipzig who had expected cruelty and received kindness instead. That girl had died in American captivity. She had been reborn as someone new, someone who understood that identity was choice, not destiny. Someone who believed in redemption earned through daily acts of goodness rather than grand gestures. The bridge, Thomas had spoken about, was not metaphor. It was reality she crossed every day. Behind her lay Germany, war, propaganda, and the ashes of a failed ideology. Ahead lay America, peace, freedom, and the possibility of building something better than what had been destroyed. Greta Brenner chose to keep moving forward. April 19, 2005. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Greta Brenner woke before dawn on her 83rd birthday, a habit formed during wartime that 60 years of peace had not broken. She dressed slowly, her arthritic hands struggling with buttons that had once been simple. Through her bedroom window, she could see the farm that had been her home for 52 years. The fields were awakening to spring. Soon Thomas would begin planting season, though at 79 he left more work to their sons and grandchildren than he had in earlier years. Today marked exactly 60 years since her capture near Leipzig. 6 decades since she had stood in morning fog expecting brutality and receiving instead the first gesture of kindness that would transform her life completely. The anniversary was not one she shared publicly. Some transformations remained personal, measured in private reflection rather than public celebration. Her daughter Sarah had planned a birthday lunch. The whole family would gather. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren so far. None of them knew war. They knew only the prosperity and peace that America had built in the decades following World War II. They knew Greta as grandmother who baked apple strudel using recipes from Bavaria and told stories about the old country in accented English that had never quite lost its German rhythm. They did not know her as Oberhelfer Muller, who had worn Wehrmacht gray and believed Nazi propaganda until American chocolate and kindness had cracked her certainty. She had told them some stories, simplified and softened for young ears. But the full truth, the depth of her transformation, remained something she shared only with those who had lived through similar journeys. After breakfast, Greta walked to her small office in the converted barn where she had worked for decades managing farm accounts and later writing. She opened the old desk drawer that held her treasures. Morrison's photograph, creased and faded but carefully preserved. Letters from Sergeant Thomas Carter spanning 36 years until his death in 1986. Anna's Christmas cards, chronicling her Iowa life until she passed in 1998. The German-English dictionary Carter had given her with his inscription still visible on the first page. Beneath these artifacts lay her manuscript. She had been writing her story for 5 years, encouraged by Sarah, who taught history at the local high school. The working title was From Enemy to Citizen, One Woman's Journey Through World War II and Beyond. Sarah wanted her to publish it. Greta remained uncertain. Some stories felt too personal to share widely, too complex to reduce to simple narrative. But perhaps that was exactly why such stories needed telling. The generation that remembered World War II was disappearing. Soon only books and documents would remain. If Greta's story could help future generations understand how enemies became friends, how hatred transformed into hope, perhaps the telling was obligation rather than choice. At noon, family arrived. Children and grandchildren filled the farmhouse with noise and laughter. They brought food and gifts and birthday cake. Thomas presided over the gathering with gentle humor that age had not diminished. He caught Greta's eye across the crowded room and smiled, the same smile that had made her say yes 52 years earlier. They had built something good together. 3 children, successful farm, life marked by ordinary kindness, repeated daily until it became extraordinary through accumulation. After lunch, Greta's oldest grandson, Michael, 16, and serious-minded, approached her with a school assignment. He was studying World War II and had questions. Most specifically, he wanted to know about her experiences as prisoner of war. His teacher had encouraged him to interview family members who remembered the war. Greta led him to the porch where they could talk privately. She told him the truth, not the simplified version she had shared when he was younger. She described Nazi indoctrination, the certainty of propaganda, the shock of American kindness that contradicted everything she believed. She described Morrison's accident and the moment she chose compassion over ideology. She described the citizenship ceremony where she renounced Germany legally while honoring it culturally. Michael listened with intensity that reminded Greta why telling these stories mattered. "So you were a Nazi?" he asked finally, not accusingly, but seeking clarity. "I wore the uniform," Greta answered carefully. "I believed the lies they taught us. But believing lies does not make someone evil, only human. What matters is what we do when we discover the truth. I discovered truth in American prisoner of war camp. I chose to accept it even though acceptance meant acknowledging I had been wrong about everything. That choice defined my life more than wearing the uniform ever did. Do you ever regret leaving Germany? Michael asked. Greta considered the question seriously. I regret what Germany became under Hitler. I regret the destruction and death. I regret that I believed propaganda long enough to serve the regime. But leaving Germany to come here? No regret at all. America gave me chance to become person I chose to be rather than person propaganda demanded. That gift was worth everything. As sunset approached and family departed, Greta sat on the porch with Thomas watching the spring evening settle over their land. 60 years since capture. 52 years since citizenship. 52 years of marriage. The numbers measured time, but could not capture transformation. You're thinking about it, Thomas observed. The anniversary, Greta nodded. 60 years ago today, I was captured by Americans who were supposed to be monsters. They gave me chocolate instead. Changed everything. Thomas took her hand, his grip still strong despite age. You changed everything. You chose to see truth when lies would have been easier to believe. That took courage most people never need to find. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Somewhere inside, great-grandchildren played while their parents cleaned up from the party. This was the future that Greta's choices had built. Not grand or historically significant, just good. A life well lived in peace and prosperity, earned through daily acts of decency repeated until they became character. Greta Muller-Brenner had been shocked when she first saw those tall American soldiers at her capture. Shocked by their kindness, their humanity, their willingness to treat enemies with dignity. That shock had rippled through 60 years of life, transforming everything it touched. The greatest victory of the war, she understood now in the twilight of her life, was not military conquest but moral transformation. America had defeated Germany on the battlefield, but America had saved Germans like Greta through simple acts of compassion that proved more powerful than any weapon. Wars ended, propaganda failed, nations rose and fell, but kindness, offered honestly and received gratefully, built bridges that lasted lifetimes. Greta had crossed that bridge from enemy to prisoner to immigrant to citizen to grandmother. Each step had required courage. Each step had been worth taking. As stars appeared in the Pennsylvania sky, Greta closed her eyes and felt grateful for impossible journeys that had become her life. She had been given second chance when she deserved none. She had built something beautiful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. She had learned that redemption was not grand gesture, but daily choice to be better than yesterday. That was enough. That was everything. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.